I like this.
I have no idea.
Okay, if anything, the speech bubble will give away what this is.
Tinkerbell hugging Peter Pan's flute.
Oh.
Peter Pan looks like Morty. Why does everyone hate the cable guy? I mean, honestly, I don't know why. I mean, they show up to your house, they hook your cable up for you. I mean, oh, you're talking about the Jim Carrey movie from the 90s. Yeah. So, I want to rewind the clock a little bit. Back in the 90s, Jim Carrey was unstoppable. I mean, legit. I mean, the Ace Ventura movies, The Mask, Liar Liar. I mean, during the 90s, he was just it in terms of very, like, screwball, slapstick comedies. He was the man. I don't think there's anyone else that could even come close to him in that era. I mean, I know Sandler, but again, Sandler was, had slapstick and all that, but his had some heartwarming, endearing stuff to it. Like Big Daddy, Happy Gilmore had some very, like, endearing stuff. And then, of course, God, that's a weird time to think about. I remember when Jim Carrey was on In Living Color. I remember, this was back when he was going by James Carrey. Not Jim Carrey, James Carrey. And he was on there with the Wayans brothers. He was on there with David Alan Grier, Kelly Cofield, just Jamie Foxx, Tommy Davidson. Amazing talent. And him being the token white guy there, that was... and he more than held his own against those comedic heavyweights. And he excelled, and he basically became, the star of one of the big stars of the 90s. And The Cable Guy is an odd one, because it was directed by Ben Stiller. Ben Stiller was on a little bit of a directing kick at that point. Still does direct every now and again. I know he did Tropic Thunder, which, that's a topical film. Robert Downey Jr. in blackface. Ain't that something? But, yeah, directed by Ben Stiller, produced by Judd Apatow. Music for the film provided by John Ottman, who worked on a lot of really good productions. I mean, The Usual Suspects, the X-Men movies, yes, even the bad ones. And yeah, I just love, and of course it starred Jim Carrey. It also had Leslie Mann, it had Matthew Broderick, it had a great cast. But there were issues. It was a black comedy, and it was considered too dark in certain regards. Also, I think this was when Jim Carrey's shtick started to be figured out by the populace. And though he did have more success later on, this was when people were just like, oh, so that's how he does it. So if I look out for this, then I'll know what to expect. And, when you know the punchline and you know what's coming, and you can see how the joke's going to get resolved, it's not funny anymore. I mean, it's the same thing that happened with Mike Myers. Mike Myers stopped being funny because people figured out a shtick. And as much as I hate that about Jim Carrey, because I loved Jim Carrey when I was younger. He was one of my favorite comedians. I mean, still one of my favorite comedy movies of all time, Liar Liar. I still quote that film to this day, man, over 20 years later. Oh, I just made myself feel old. The fact that that's over 20 years old now still, hits me in the soul. But we have the Cable Guy. Or not the Cable Guy, but Why Does Everyone Hate the Cable Guy by the Nostalgia Critic. And I guess let's dig into it and see why. Here we go.
Hello, I'm the Nostalgia Critic guy. Remember it so you don't have to. Jim Carrey has gone through a lot of ups and downs in his career, hasn't he?
Quite.
Some big hits and cult favorites, while also some big bombs and forgettable projects. But people forget early on there was a movie many thought would ruin his career. And that movie, kinda strangely enough, was Cable Guy. It's amazing the amount of hate this film got. Both critics of Jim Carrey and fans as well saw this as one of his biggest blunders. It's too dark, many people said. It's just not the typical Jim Carrey thing. The film didn't even really bomb, but the hatred from it was so massive that several see it as a giant failure. Luckily, he made Liar Liar immediately after, and his status was right back on track. But years after its release, I have to ask the question, is it really deserving of so much hate?
I don't think so.
The film, in case you don't know, is about...
It's odd, but I don't think it's deserving of hate. I mean, it's just... Again, it was just such an odd choice at the time. I think people were just like, oh, this is going to ruin Carrey. But it didn't. Turns out they just had to wait a few more years for The Majestic to come out. Oops, did I just say that out loud? Actually, The Majestic was all right, but Jesus, was that film just not good, in my opinion.
About a cable repairman played by Carrey, who befriends a client played by Matthew Broderick. When Carrey gets too clingy and Broderick tries to break the friendship off, Carrey obsesses over him and does all the typical stalker tropes you'd expect him to see, driving Broderick mad. At the time, people weren't used to seeing Carrey in such a villainous role. I mean, okay, he did Riddler, but that movie was about as dark as a Care Bears episode.
It's the car, right? Chicks love the car.
Shut up, Kilmer.
This was the first time we saw him in dark shadows, gloomy backdrops, and creepy glowing eyes. He was still goofy, with a not surprisingly over-the-top lisp, but people said they just found it too jarring for Carrey to be in this role. Funny, seeing how Carrey would do much darker roles in the future, getting both critical and audience praise. The film was also a hard hit for its director Ben Stiller, who just had his show canceled, got panned for doing the movie, and shortly after would get grilled for directing Zoolander. Yeah, there was a time where even this movie was despised, partly because of the controversy involving erasing the World Trade Center from the film shortly after 9/11. Nowadays, though, who even remembers that? We just see it now as a funny movie. It even has a sequel coming out. Since then,
Which was a disappointment. I love Zoolander, but I do not like Zoolander 2.
Though Stiller has happily gotten some pretty big hits. He even directed a film that got an Academy Award nomination. Which is why I ask now, if we're more forgiving of strange humor and dark tones, is it possible Cable Guy isn't really that bad? It just came out at the wrong time? I mean, don't get me wrong, I wouldn't be shocked if you didn't like the film. Carrey's voice can get a little annoying, not all the jokes work, and it's not exactly a comic masterpiece. But I think there is more to this movie than people are giving it credit for. First of all, it centers around torturing Matthew Broderick. Immediately a great setup. Second, the idea of an awkward stalker like this back then might not have been seen as so mainstream. Once in a while I come across a person who said, oh yeah, I love that movie. I've known a few clingy people like that. But for most they claim that Carrey was just acting too weird to even understand what he was doing. Now, with the internet, online stalking, and people getting emotional for even the tiniest thing, look back on this guy. Don't you think you might have seen someone like this before? He's obsessed over TV from the past, he thinks life is one big show, he has a problem with boundaries. Yeah, with the social media, we've all come across this guy now.
It's sort of like Demolition Man. I mean, Demolition Man, when you look at how the characters act and everything, you know, how the surface world is the PC culture, whereas the underground is sort of the, you know, the underground that strives to make the world more chaotic, because that's, in all honesty, you know, you need a little bit of chaos and you need a little bit of, you know, kindness and caring. And I think Jim Carrey's character here would be seen as sort of the obsessive, chat forum guy who's obsessed with nostalgia, thinks that his opinion matters most, and, you know, wants everyone to like him. And God, the amount of people I ran into like that. I went into forums for conversation, and instead I get lectures, like literally like TLDRs. That's like, hello. But yeah. Anyway, back to this.
Every day we see arguments and accusations from people who seem in their own sheltered world. One that's clearly not a part of reality. If you just replace Cable Guy with Guy Who Never Leaves the YouTube comment section, suddenly this makes a lot more sense, doesn't it? Thus, you can now see where the humor is coming from. Most awkward people online talk tough but hide behind the mother's skirt of ambiguity. Here, it's funny to imagine if that one guy didn't just like weird stuff but was actually desperate enough to devote his entire life to you. Come on, you know that one person you've speculated about. The one that was just a little too clingy? Isn't it funny to imagine they're doing creepy stuff like letting spiders crawl across their face, infiltrating your family, or donning disguises to follow you? You don't think they'd really do it. In fact, they could actually be nice people. But admit it, it's funny to think how far someone being socially awkward can go.
Yeah, and as someone who's socially awkward, you know, I've had people think that, you know, I'm obsessive and all that. I'm like, no, here's the thing. I'm just awkward. I'm Captain Obvious, the king of awkward right here. And honestly, you know, people take my awkwardness as me trying, as, you know, just, I guess they see it as me being too forward. I don't know. But anyway.
It's like an Office Space. We all know that uncomfortable stapler guy. He's weird, but you try to tell yourself he's harmless. That just makes it even funnier when he says he's gonna do something insane like burn down the building. It's one of the movie's most memorable lines from one of its most memorable characters. The awkward, creepy person has also been used for comedy in Pitch Perfect, Key and Peele, There's Something About Mary, and several others. So yeah, it seems more and more we're understanding that these people do exist. To what extent? Well, that's where the comedy comes in. We like to imagine and push it further and further than what's probably more realistic. But that's what comedy's all about. So now that we have a better understanding years later not only how many of these kinds of people there are, but this film's intention to mockingly poke fun of them, is it possible that it was just misunderstood? I'm not saying you have to like the film. As I said before, there's perfectly sound reasons to find it kind of annoying at times. But the arguments given in the past of it either being too dark or too weird doesn't seem to hold up anymore.
Not really.
We have opened up to the darker stuff, and we have become more aware of strange, clingy people in our everyday lives. Knowing this now, a lot of this is a lot funnier than you may remember. And compared to other things today, it's not even really that dark. Yeah, it's got some heavy shadows and weird shots, but the story itself, is it really that intense when you compare it to other dark comedies? Perhaps much like Zoolander, if we're willing to relax and just accept the bizarreness of this scenario, especially now understanding the context more, there can be a pretty clever comedy. Watch it again this time and don't take it too seriously. The idea is, wouldn't it be funny if the social shut-in you knew could do such over-the-top lengths? Not that he actually is. It's an exaggeration, like a lot of great comedy. And it's definitely worth giving another chance. Yeah, it's still odd and not every joke gets a laugh, but it deserves to be judged again with the more updated knowledge of its subject matter. It doesn't say or do anything shocking, it's just a funny film about extremes. At its heart, it's just a dumb, goofy comedy, but it's a clever, dumb, goofy comedy. And one you can probably go back, rewatch, and proudly say to yourself, hey, this isn't too dark for me. I'm a nostalgia critic guy, remember? So you don't have to.
Cable guy. Yeah, so my sister quoted that one line incessantly, just like cable guy, because she liked Jim Carrey too a lot, and oh gosh, I'd hear her say that every now and again. I'd just be like, ugh. But. I'd say Cable Guy, you know, retrospectively, is a better film. Knowing that the subject matter that is covered in it makes more sense now than it did back in 95, 96 when it came out originally. Yeah, it's a lot better, I feel. God. So I think Doug hits the nail on the head pretty well on this one. I think that, you know, Cable Guy seems harmless enough. I wouldn't mind. Yeah, I wouldn't mind it. I wouldn't mind, you know, I don't mind it in the modern context. Although, you know, watching it originally, I was expecting, you know, the typical Jim Carrey farce. But instead I got that. And looking back on it, I remember I watched it, I think, about 7 or 8 years after I originally saw it. And I understood it more. That's weird. It's weird when you retrospectively watch something that you knew you didn't really gravitate towards when you were younger, but the older you get and the more you come to understand people and the more you come to understand the world as a whole, yeah, it makes sense. But anyway, I think that's gonna do it, everyone. This was Why Does Everyone Hate the Cable Guy by the Nostalgia Critic. Hopefully you all enjoyed. If you want to see more from Doug Walker and the Nostalgia Critic and Channel Awesome, feel free to click the Channel Awesome name in the title of the video. If you want to see more from me, feel free to click that subscribe button, ring that bell to stay notified. And until next time, I'm Nate. I will see you then. Peace out.